Brother and I wanted to give this particular message today because, in one sense, many of you were not here 5 or 6 years ago. And so I thought I would take advantage of that situation and give a message that I gave back then, because mainly it is always timely, and we need something like this, I hope, ever so often. And for the first few minutes, you might want to hold on to your stomach, but anyway, you'll see why. I titled this message, "If It Seems Right, It Must Be Right." If it seems right, it must be right. I remember long ago, brethren, when my brother and I were around 7 and 8 years old, I remember a lesson that we learned. At least we learned it for that moment in time. Our granddaddy, on my dad's side of the family, he would smoke cigars. Sometimes I believe he would even chew tobacco, while our grandmother would dip snuff, which is a powdered tobacco. She would place some of it between her gum and the lower lip, if you remember, if y'all can remember that. And a few seconds after that, it would start dripping down the side of her mouth. And then it looked like chocolate. Well, I guess my brother had often seen our granddaddy smoke those cigars and occasionally maybe take a big chew of that tobacco. We call it a plug of tobacco. It was shaped like a square, and it was neatly wrapped in a clear wrapper. And at that moment, as a kid, you could look at it, and it did resemble a candy bar. And it looked tasty. And if I thought that, and I did, then I knew that my brother also would think that. And he did. Yet, at that time, I had no desire for it at all, nor did I want that snuff that my grandmother dipped. But my brother, he did have a craving for this most odd-looking candy bar that my granddaddy seemed to enjoy in that square wrapper. I remember my brother would often harass our daddy to buy him this particular square-shaped candy bar because it looked oh so good, and that meant it was tasty. Daddy would always say to his son, his younger son, "No, son." And my brother would say something like, "But it looks so good, Daddy," or words to that effect. "Son," said Daddy, "it is not a bar of candy." "But Daddy, Granddaddy likes it. He eats it. It must be good." "Can I have one, please, Daddy? Can I have one of these candy bars?" You know, this went on for, I guess, at least 2 or 3 weeks. I can remember this as if it was 50-some years ago. In fact, it was more than that. My brother would, he really wanted what was called a chew of that tobacco. And Dad would discourage him for a long time. But brother, though, he would always come back beseeching Dad to, once again, "Dad, I'd like to have a chew of that fine chocolate candy bar." And then came the time that I remember my daddy had apparently had enough of his son's or my brother's harassment. Just kept harassing him. My daddy had enough of my brother's nagging and enough of my son's craving for something that Dad already knew was not good for him, letting him know once again, "That chew, son, will make you sick, especially if you swallow the juice." Just because it looked so inviting and so good or so delicious does not mean that it is, son. Yet my dear, dear brother, he kept ignoring those admonitions from his dad, and he wanted it anyways. So Dad, he bought my brother a plug of that delicious candy bar we called chewing tobacco. My brother had not grasped the fact that it was chewing tobacco, not swallowing tobacco. My dad, he cut him off a fairly good-sized piece of this tasty-looking candy, and he handed it to him. My dear brother put it into his mouth quickly, starting to chew on it, and apparently he began to swallow some of the juice of that tobacco. Alas, brethren, candy it did not taste like. He began to surmise while he was chomping on it. He was making a deep, profound mistake. He continued to chew on it, waiting, I assumed then, for that he would begin to taste the nice, sweet, candy-like flavor that would come from it. As some of that tobacco began to really ooze on down his throat. And you got the picture of that. He's, chomping on it, and he didn't know he wasn't supposed to swallow. Anyway, my friends, it did not take long for him to conclude that he was making a mistake. Why, Dad was right. It didn't taste like candy. And he was in the middle of making a mistake, and it was too late to stop the effects that he was beginning to feel. Now, put yourself in that position at 7 years of age. Why, oh why had he done this? Why didn't he heed his father's instruction? But it was too late. Why didn't he heed his father's instructions about what Dad had told him to do or not to do? I wonder, by this time, are you beginning to detect a little theme here? I think he not only got sick on his stomach, he also got upset at his daddy not stopping him earlier. Oh, if only he had believed his dad, for this event would not have been engraved in his mind, or even in mine, because I'm the one that remembered it. Because he would not have reaped what he was about to sow. Or what? Yes. Well, anyway, I really don't recall too much after all this for that moment in time, but a lesson had been learned by my brother, and it reassured me that once again, our dad, who was much older and knew a lot more knowledge, and my dad was right. Dad knew this would happen. And it reminded me of that old TV show, Father Knows Best. Well, our Father knew best. Reminds me of a broader lesson, brethren, for the day, when morally and spiritually, people want to do what seems right to them, what looks right, what feels right. And when we don't listen or follow those instructions of our Heavenly Father, well, we reap the results. God says when we sin, that is, go against God's laws and do what we think is spiritually or morally right, what looks good, and so forth, we're going to pay the price. Well, God says in Romans 6:23, the wages, the end result of disobedience or sin is death. And brother, in the longer viewpoint, I'm talking about eternal death. Things may look right. They may feel right. They may taste good in its appearance in the mind. And it can be so tempting. But I've also found out if God is not in it, and if we don't do what He says and how to think, that too will end in eventual eternal death. Whether it is a child or a full-grown adult, people in general, brethren, do seem to just have to learn lessons of life that can cause harm. They've got to learn it the hard way. Many ignore God's ways that do lead to, I'll just call it their well-being, because it seems people want well-being, want happiness, but they want it now. They don't want to wait on it later on. They want it now. And brethren, we don't know the depth of our building godly character till God and even ourselves know how we react under pressure, under stress. So God will allow us to learn our weaknesses for our good, if need be, over a long period of time. In James 1, verse 2, James said, "My brethren, count it or consider it all joy when we fall into different various trials and problems, even though that may be very difficult to practice." In essence, we must learn sometimes we will have to feel the pain and do God's way anyway, when it seems almost impossible. God says we may have to endure to the end. That's just about what we may have to do. A phrase comes to mind when I wrote this: never judge a book by its cover. Just because, spiritually and morally speaking, sometimes something looks good, looks right, doesn't mean it is right, unless God is in the picture. Now, brethren, that plug of chewing tobacco looked so good to my brother. But no matter the warnings that our dad gave him, he just had to have it. He just had to taste it. For he just didn't really believe what his dad was saying. Now, brother, I was there and I watched the whole thing. While this plug of tobacco, it wouldn't affect him. Maybe it might affect the other kid on the street somewhere down there, but it wouldn't affect him. Here's a lesson. It reminds me of something on a greater scale that you can find in Ecclesiastes 8:11. Sometimes because God does not punish instantly, or His laws don't take effect instantly, people feel it is safe to go ahead and do something anyway. Why, in a lot of cases, nothing happened. I've gotten away with it, whatever it was. Why, I stole that pencil. The boy never knew it. Why, I stole that person's mate. Hey, nothing happened. But also, God says in Numbers 32, verse 23, your sin will find you out. For whatever a man sows, whether it's good or bad, he will also reap in time. You know, brethren, even with his dad's guiding instructions and his dad's warnings, My brother chose to partake of that forbidden fruit, you might say, because it looked good. While he would take a chance on not getting sick. And I would guess in life, many people tend to think the same way. Nothing's happened, nothing's going to happen. Brethren, Adam and Eve took a chance, and their sin found them out. For that way that seems so right to follow, morally, spiritually, does require little effort. Does require little thinking it through. Little control of one's passions, simply because if it feels good, if it looks right, then just do it. For that road that would lead to well-being and happiness in time, brethren, is apparently the road less taken in this world of so many people, of the past and the present, and yes, even in the near future. And I wondered, does man have to learn to follow God's ways and His truths to be able to learn the way to eternal life? Does man have to literally choose God's way? Yes. God says, I've set before you. This for modern times as well as back then. I have set before you life and death. I've set before you blessings and cursings, therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. But this choosing is part of the gift that our God gave us. Well, He wants all people in time to want His truth from the hearts. And so He gave us free will. And He pleads with His creation to choose His ways. Ezekiel 33:11. God says, I don't take any pleasure in the death of the wicked, all who refuse to obey God. I take no pleasure in that, but rather that they would turn from their ways and that they would live. And then God says, turn. And then He says it again, turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, says God. And therefore, brethren, we can conclude, let us always, through thick and thin, choose the way of God, and the way that we must go. For it is He, brethren, in Matthew 24:13 and 14, it is He who will endure to the end. The same shall be saved. And now I wonder how many people would like to have a chew of tobacco now.